When you walk through the narrow streets of old European towns, you might pass buildings that have been standing since the Middle Ages. It's mind-bending to think that some of these houses have survived wars, fires, storms, and centuries of restless human hands, all without a trace of modern construction technology to prop them up. Their timbers have warped and creaked, stone walls weathered and blackened, yet they endure, stubborn witnesses to the passing centuries. But to understand how medieval builders created structures so enduring that we can still visit them today, you must first peer through the keyhole of time and see the people who built and lived in them, because each wall, each roof beam, each weather-beaten facade was shaped as much by social class as by any mason's hand. Medieval society rose like a living pyramid of stone and soil, each level resting on the shoulders of the one below. At the very top perched the royalty kings and queens, who wielded their crowns like shields and swords at once, commanding armies, dictating taxes, launching wars over a patch of earth or a bruised ego. To be born royal was to win the grandest lottery history ever devised. Power handed down like an heirloom blade, sharp enough to cut a kingdom in two. Beneath them, the nobles carved out their existence in vast estates, their days drifting between feasts weighed down by silver platters and the occasional ride to battle, sometimes clad in armor, more decorative than useful. Their castles, built not just to impress but to endure siege and storm, rose like stone sentinels, symbols of protection that could as easily become cages. Then there were the merchants, the guildmasters, the skilled craftsmen, the middle class of the medieval world. These were the builders of timber-framed houses, the planners of streets that still confuse visitors today, their hands stained with ink, dye, or soot. They brokered deals beneath the vaulted ceilings of town halls, or hammered iron in narrow alleys behind bustling markets. They didn't wield power like kings or land like lords, but they owned something far more enduring: craft, knowledge, and the relentless grit to turn raw material into livelihood. At the base of this vast pyramid stood the peasants, the quiet tide that fed everyone above them. 90% of the people who called the medieval world home bent their backs to the soil. Sunrise to sunset, they tilled fields, tended flocks, wove what they could not afford to buy. Some were free to wander from village to village in search of better work, others bound to a lord's land like roots that could not pull themselves free. Their taxes were paid in bushels of grain, days of labor, and silence, for complaining about your lot to the wrong noble could leave you rotting in a dungeon colder than any winter's night. Yet the peasants' toil was the lifeblood of the realm. Without their muddy boots, the banquets would go hungry, the cities would starve. The irony was not lost on them, but survival often leaves little room for revolt. Above it all loomed the church, straddling every rung of the social ladder. Priests and bishops blessed kings, crowned emperors, and forgave sins, whispered through iron grates and damp chapels. Cathedrals soared into the clouds, built stone by the same peasants who knelt in their shadows. The church offered hope and control. Education, such as it was, trickled down mostly to boys destined for holy orders or administrative service, while the rest of the population carried on half illiterate but heavy with superstition and faith in equal measure. This rigid hierarchy, this feudal handshake of protection for labor, didn't just shape how medieval people lived. It shaped how they built. It carved social status into mortar and would so deeply that centuries later, we can still read those divisions in the bones of old towns. Imagine one of those cities now, a tangle of crooked streets and leaning houses, wrapped in walls as thick as the trunk of an ancient oak. At the heart, a cathedral, its spire piercing the sky like a promise that God was watching. Beside it, a castle or fortified manor, grim reminders that power was never far from violence. From this sacred and political heart, the city rippled outward like a pond disturbed by a stone. The wealthiest merchants claimed prime real estate within sight of the cathedral doors, close enough to catch the incense drifting from morning mass, but far enough from the ramparts to avoid being the first victims when enemies breached the gates. For make no mistake, those gates did close each sunset, huge wooden jaws, locking out the night's dangers and locking in the secrets of the day. Walk these streets in your mind's eye, and you'd find entire neighborhoods devoted to single trades here. A street of tanners whose pungent vats turned animal hides into leather. Their bakers whose ovens sent warmth spilling into alleys on winter mornings. Blacksmiths' hammers rang like bells, the clash of iron echoing through foggy courtyards. Move closer to the city walls, and the story darkens. The poorest clung to the margins, in shacks so narrow they seemed stitched to the fortifications themselves. Here, your neighbor's roof might lean so close you could reach across and knock on their door without leaving your window. Disease festered where sunlight rarely reached. The same walls that kept out marauders trapped the stench of unwashed bodies, slaughtered livestock, and the inevitable rot of waste that medieval drainage struggled to carry away. Yet, within this filth and clamor lay a kind of genius, a survival logic written into every beam and cobblestone. These winding lanes weren't laid out by architects drafting precise plans. They formed organically, paths worn by centuries of feet tracing the easiest route between well and market, church and workshop, home and city gate. Straight lines were the work of Romans long gone. All else was a tapestry of necessity. At the human scale, each house was a world unto itself. For the prosperous middle class, homes doubled as shops, the street-facing ground floor, a display of goods or tools. The back a kitchen, where the hearth burned day and night, smoke curling up through timber beams, preserving wood as surely as salt preserved meat. Family life and business life folded into one another like layers of a manuscript, each page written in the soot that clung to walls and the straw that softened the floor. Climb the stairs and you'd find a single large room, partitioned by curtains or rough planks. Privacy was a modern luxury unknown to most medieval folk. Apprentices might sleep by the foot of the master's bed, children tucked 3 to a pallet. Overhead, beams creaked with age, jettied upper floors jutting out beyond the street below. A clever trick that snatched extra space without paying extra rent on the land beneath. Rain, too, was kept at bay by these overhangs, an accidental kindness to passersby, caught without a cloak. Even the materials used spoke volumes about resourcefulness and constraint. Oak beams, cut in winter when sap ran low, were seasoned for months before they found their place in the frame. Gaps between timbers were filled with wattle and daub, a slurry of sticks, clay, straw, and manure, binding earth and beast into walls that breathed and decayed in a cycle older than memory. Each house was an investment, a shelter, and a legacy, passed from father to son, along with the tools to repair it when rot inevitably found its way in. For many families, these creaking rooms were more than shelter. They were survival itself. Workshops for weaving, spinning, brewing ale. Rents were supplemented by subletting rooms, the original medieval Airbnb, though your guests were more likely to be journeymen than tourists. And when you picture the builders themselves, don't imagine laborers blindly swinging hammers. These were master craftsmen whose guilds guarded secrets of joinery and measurement like holy relics. An apprentice might spend a decade learning how to shape a beam so precisely that, as the green wood dried, it would tighten the joints, making the structure stronger with each passing year. To this day, you can trace a carpenter's hand in the Roman numerals etched into beams' medieval assembly instructions that outlasted entire dynasties. Timber-framed houses, when raised, became neighborhood spectacles. Whole communities gathered to haul beams upright, an act of shared labor rewarded with barrels of ale and stories retold by firelight. And when the walls settled and creaked in the night, many whispered of ghosts, not knowing it was simply the living wood, shrinking into itself, binding joints tighter with every season. And then there were the castles and manor houses, built of stone quarried by calloused hands from hills that echoed with the ring of chisels. Walls 8 feet thick, windows narrow as a knight's visor, defensive architecture married to displays of wealth that bordered on the divine. Within those walls, tapestries woven with threads of gold fought off the cold, while cellars beneath stored wine and salted meat, enough to outlast a siege or a long, punishing winter. But if the grandeur of noble halls leaves you in awe, remember the contrast it cast on the lives of those who huddled in huts barely larger than a stable. Peasant cottages, with walls of mud and roofs of thatch, slumped against the earth they sprang from. They kept animals inside to survive the cold, turning living quarters into barnyards by necessity. When rain fell through a leaking roof, the smell of damp straw and manure must have reminded every soul inside that shelter was never a guarantee. Only a fragile promise renewed each spring with new thatch and patched walls. Yet even these humble dwellings, often built in mere weeks with materials gathered by hand, stand as proof that ingenuity can bloom anywhere. From the humblest peasant hut to the timber homes of merchants, to castles that defied both battering rams and centuries of wind, each structure was more than wood or stone. Each was a quiet rebellion against time itself, a defiance of decay. And they endure because generations of builders knew, almost instinctively, how to bend nature's rules to human will. Stand at the threshold of a medieval city at dawn, when the mist clings low to the cobbled streets and the first market carts creak through the gates. You'll see the same structures you saw by daylight, but in the hush, before the city wakes. They feel different, like they might whisper their secrets if you listen closely enough. Imagine the master carpenters pacing a timber yard outside, the walls, examining the skeletons of ancient oaks felled miles away. Each tree chosen with a reverence we've almost forgotten. Its rings counted not just for strength, but for the story they told of storms survived and seasons endured. They worked with simple tools, adzes, chisels, saws, longer than a grown man, yet their calculations were exacting. They understood how to coax a beam into position so that the house would settle tighter with every passing year. Its creaks and groans just the voice of the wood, remembering the forest it once belonged to, while these craftsmen shaped the middle class. Houses that lined the city's arteries. A different breed of builders toiled on the monuments of power that still dominate skylines today. Castles and cathedrals, each a fortress against the chaos outside. Each a symbol of faith or force that bent entire generations to their will. A noble's manor could take decades to complete, a labor that spanned the lifetime of a single lord and continued under his children's watch. Foundations dug deep into bedrock, walls laid with rubble-filled masonry, dressed stone fitted so perfectly it needed no mortar in places. Iron cramps, poured with lead, locked these massive slabs together. Technology so sturdy that the same techniques would reappear centuries later in bridges and fortresses we still walk across. Within these thick walls, a labyrinth of rooms emerged. The great hall where feasts turned to intrigues. Solar chambers where the lady of the house wove. Tapestries both literal and political. Strong rooms hidden behind false panels where family treasures slept behind iron locks. Some noble houses even ran primitive plumbing, rainwater gathered from vast roofs and channeled through lead pipes. A marvel of its time, and yet a slow poison trickling into the blood of those who drank from pewter cups, oblivious to the unseen danger, yet stone alone didn't make these places impregnable. Look closer and you'll find secrets hidden in plain sight. Murder holes above the gatehouse to rain oil on invaders. Spiral staircases that turned clockwise so right-handed defenders could swing their swords freely while attackers stumbled upward, disadvantaged by design. Architecture as weapon, walls as both shield and statement. Outside these bastions of wealth and rule, the rest of the city bent to its orbit. The merchants, who dealt in spices from the east and wool from the green fields beyond the walls, reinvested their fortunes in sturdy homes that blended practicality with a quiet kind of pride. Many commissioned decorative carvings on beams or lintels, dragons coiled around doorways, saints etched into window frames to ward off evil. Every mark was a message. This is who I am, what I've earned, and what I hope to pass on when I'm gone. But these ambitions would have collapsed into mud and ruin without the unseen hands that did the heaviest lifting. The quarrymen, the sawyers, the thatchers whose work rarely earned them a name in a family record. These men, and sometimes entire families, would camp near their work sites, sleeping beside the stone that would become some lord's banquet hall or a merchant's sturdy wall. The smell of lime kilns burning outside town was the scent of a city in the making. The earth, cooked and transformed into mortar that sealed dreams into stone. As cities grew more prosperous, walls once meant only for defense became symbols of status too. Fortifications expanded in rings, each new wall built farther out, enclosing farms and vineyards, bakeries and tanneries, all feeding the hungry core. Gates multiplied, towers rose higher, and watchmen patrolled with oil lamps that cast flickering shadows across rough-hewn streets. Water was lifeblood. Wells dotted the courtyards. Public fountains stood like gathering places for gossip and rumor. But rivers were fickle companions, essential trade routes that carried salt, grain, and iron from distant lands, yet just as ready to flood streets with disease when waste and filth choked their banks. The medieval mind understood this duality well, life and decay, side by side, water as savior and curse. Inside the walls, daily life teetered between order and chaos. The same street that hosted a fair by day could turn into a battleground by night. Fires were an ever-present terror. A single stray spark from a hearth could devour entire blocks of timber houses, the flames leaping from one jettied upper floor to the next, like a predator tasting fresh prey. It is why medieval cities passed some of Europe's first fire safety laws, crude by our standards, but born of desperation. In these tight quarters, superstition and faith did battle. 2. A household might bury a mummified cat inside a wall to ward off evil, or press relics into a beam above the hearth, hoping some saint's protection might keep the structure standing through the next great storm. These small acts stitched belief into brick and beam proof that shelter was more than physical, that walls could guard the soul as well as the body. Yet perhaps the greatest testament to medieval resilience lies in how these structures, built without blueprints as we know them, survived generations of conflict. Many bore witness to sieges that turned once busy streets into rivers of fear. Those thick gates slammed shut as riders crested distant hills, banners snapping in the wind. Inside, people gathered in the great hall, the stone walls muffling their whispered prayers and the hammering of siege. Engines beyond. When the danger passed, if it passed, repairs began almost at once. Stones replaced by hand, beams lifted anew, thatched roofs patched against the next downpour. And so the cycle repeated, year after year, century after century, until some towns became palimpsests, layers of conquest, faith, wealth, and desperation, written one atop the other, half forgotten, yet indelible. It is easy, standing before an old timber house today, to see only the charm, the crooked beams, the leaning gables that look like they might collapse with the next stiff wind. But what you're seeing is something far greater, an argument against impermanence, a quiet reminder that what we build with care and understanding can last far beyond the span of any single life. Look closer, and you will see the truth hidden. In those warped walls, the same hands that worked the soil by day, hauling grain for their lord, also raised beams at dusk to shelter their children. The same rivers that brought plague and dark years fed the wells that kept cities alive. The same walls that trapped poverty within their shadows also shielded knowledge, guild secrets, coded craft, the unwritten rules that shaped medieval urban life like a secret manuscript passed down without words. Some of these secrets may never fully reveal themselves. They lie in the gaps between old stones, in the pegs that bind ancient timbers together, in the cathedral spires that still rise above towns that no longer remember the names of those who hauled each block into place. And yet, as long as these buildings stand, even when leaning at impossible angles, they will continue to whisper that not all was lost to the flames of time. This hidden architecture, born of necessity, faith, and an unspoken pact with the land, remains a bridge between our age and a world where survival was an art form and every home, no matter how humble, was a fortress against the endless storm. This is where the echoes of medieval builders still speak through creaking floorboards, crumbling mortar, and beams that breathe like the living wood they once were. And if you stand quietly enough, you may sense them, guiding your eyes along the lines they drew centuries ago, showing you that beneath our modern foundations, the ancient craft of holding back the dark endures. There's a peculiar feeling that washes over you when you step through the doorway of a medieval building that's outlasted every name once written in its ledgers. Perhaps it's the hush in the timbers, the subtle give beneath your feet, where countless boots once scraped dirt across floorboards worn soft by time. Or maybe it's the certainty that even now, centuries on, these walls are not entirely silent. They murmur fragments of the lives they once cradled. Imagine a modest, timber-framed house, leaning slightly to one side in some narrow street of York or Bruges. To the casual eye, it's a quaint relic. To the inquisitive mind, it's a code, a record of medieval endurance etched in oak and wattle. That crooked angle isn't a flaw. It's the story of joints settling, wood shrinking and breathing, pegs binding tighter over time. You can almost picture the master carpenter guiding an apprentice's trembling hands, the lessons spoken softly, the mistakes forgiven, the promise that if you get the angles right, this house might outlive every king that rules the land. In these dwellings, every beam holds fingerprints. Each patch of adobe conceals the toil of peasants who balance survival against duty to their lords. You might think of medieval life as backward, grimy, crude, but study these structures long enough and you'll see they are anything but primitive. They are ingenuity distilled. They are human stubbornness made solid. They are proof that to endure is sometimes the greatest art of all. Step out of that house and walk toward the city walls. In the cold dawn, they rise before you thick, ramparts of limestone, granite, or whatever rock could be pried from the earth nearby. These fortifications, so beautiful now in their mossy decay, were once the last defense against chaos. When enemy armies approached, farmers would flee inside these walls. Livestock herded through narrow gates just before they slammed shut with an echo that signaled survival or siege. Look closer at those gates and you'll find not just brute stone, but cunning portcullises rigged to drop in the blink of an eye, arrow slits that turn every foot soldier into a shielded sentinel, tunnels carved beneath the walls to catch attackers unaware, a cat-and-mouse game of engineering and destruction, played in secret by candlelight while the townsfolk above whispered prayers to saints for deliverance. For the wealthiest, castles were the apex of this defensive architecture, and yet they were more than fortresses. They were statements carved in quarried rock, power embodied, authority given form. But even these grand halls could become prisons, trapping kings and nobles behind battlements when the people outside grew restless. A castle could be a stronghold or a tomb, depending on whose hands held the gate keys. Meanwhile, far beyond the city gates, peasants lived in the shadow of these stone giants, clinging to small patches of land that were both home and inheritance. Their cottages were as vulnerable as they were resourceful, roofs thatched with reeds or straw, walls patched with clay dug from nearby pits. In winter, families huddled close to a single smoky hearth, their breath frosting in the dim light. Pigs and chickens slept inside for warmth, the line between livestock and family blurred by necessity. It was crude, yes, but it worked. And the fact that traces of these tiny homes still surface when archaeologists peel back layers of modern roads tells us everything about the quiet genius of building simply with what you have. Yet what truly binds these structures together, grand castles, bustling merchant houses, humble crofts, is something deeper than stone or timber. It's the knowledge, passed from hand to hand, spoken aloud in workshops, whispered in guilt, scratched onto scraps of parchment now lost to mildew and flame, a lineage of skill, carried forward not by books alone but by practice, a secret language of chisels, plumb lines, and pegs that tightened with time. There is a theory spoken of by historians who delight in the echoes of what we can never fully prove, that hidden within some medieval buildings lie coded messages. Not the simple mason's marks still visible on cathedral stones, but more elusive hints. Angles chosen to catch a solstice sunrise, proportions echoing sacred geometry. Ancient as the temples of Egypt, a craftsman might have left his sign beneath a floorboard, a symbol that meant nothing to the uninitiated but everything to a brother of the craft. We cannot say for certain that these codes exist, But when you stand in a medieval church and the sun pours through a stained glass window exactly on midsummer's dawn, you feel it that the builders knew more than they said, that they spoke to the cosmos in beams and arches, their knowledge woven into mortar so subtly that we call it superstition only because we have forgotten how to listen. Consider the churches and cathedrals themselves, impossible feats of engineering for an age without steel cranes or electric light. Flying buttresses, balancing walls taller than any fortress. Vaulted ceilings that still cradle frescoes painted by hands, centuries-cold roofs made of lead sheets that survive the crack of thunder, the pounding of rain, the torch of revolution, and beneath it all, the crypts, the bones of saints and kings mingling in the dark, the stone so worn by pilgrims' feet that it gleams like a riverbed. No wonder the peasants who glimpsed these cathedrals rising above their villages believed the builders were blessed, or perhaps, in whispered suspicion, that they knew secrets forbidden to ordinary folk. In an age when death lurked behind every infection and every bad harvest, these buildings offered both sanctuary and proof that something greater than any one life could endure. This is what makes the old architecture so magnetic to us now. Not just its beauty, but the defiance buried in its walls, a promise that our hands can shape what outlives our frail bodies. A reminder that knowledge, once earned, can be carried forward if only we care to protect it. And maybe, if we listen closely enough, we can still hear what the builders meant to tell us. That shelter is more than walls, that endurance is more than stone, and that every generation, no matter how battered by war, or plague, or time, leaves behind a map for those who come after. So next time you wander those ancient streets, let your eyes trace the lines where beams meet plaster, where iron locks bite into oak doors. Pause beneath the arch of a city gate. Run your hand across stones, smoothed by 1,000 years of footsteps. Know that you are standing in the company of countless souls, carpenters, stonemasons, peasants, nobles, each one anonymous now, yet each one still speaking through the craft they left behind. For when all else crumbles, when names are lost and kings forgotten, what remains are these testaments in timber and stone, each one a testament to our oldest truth, that to build, to protect, and to pass on knowledge is what binds us to the generations we will never meet, and the ones who will one day wonder if they too might leave something that will stand against the storms of time.